As always, I appreciate um, the comment made on one of the earlier um, videos on history and the historical consciousness. A few videos back in this playlist. However, understanding what they're asking complicates the reception of this conversation in the following way. People pose questions exactly because there's something they want clarified, but the clarification enters into the substance of the question itself, so that if the issue were clarified, they would probably pose the question differently. So somebody thoughtfully hearing a question has to also hear the fact that the question has been posed prior to what the question is about being understood. The answer then hovers about in the unclarity of the substance of the question when it's asked, and then somebody has asked, what about the idea of God in the terms of historical consciousness? So, for instance, we had the simple example of project history as an issue where a certain ethos, say of the Romans, could be projected into the inner life, inner Erlebnis of another group. So, for instance, in the example given was the historian Tacitus writing on the Jews, projecting into the inner life of Moses the motivation of contriving to have himself made king, which is not a sensible motivation to regard Moses in the light of, so far as we want to enter into Jewish thinking that would think Moses as the chief prophet of the Jews. We would have to go to somebody like Maimonides, and then we could see how even in Maimonides we have a split between Aristotelian Moses and the Guide to the Perplexed, which you could read the Guide to the Outsiders, or the Jewish Maimonides of from a pious point of view, we could say, in Nietzschean terms. So there's indeed points of view, and not just the not yet split version, the authentic version, but what points of view. Then we have the Mishneh Torah version. But so this question posed is difficult because one, what is the starting point? So if we just make a timeline and say what's the first time this word were used, that doesn't assure us at all that it has the meaning given by the one asking the question. Put another way, the common usage, the usage we find, the dictionary usage of the word God circa 2023 is not the same as what a grave and pious man would have understood the word to mean in, let's say, the year 1250 in the say the lands of the Carolingians, somewhere in middle Europa, let's say. this whole theme makes me think of Dugin's um, sort of Grimmishkeit, or I think of Dugin in a way from the point of view of Jakob Boehme, from Jakob Boehme, who has come after Lutheran Protestantism in the moment when there's a confusion and there's a attempt to reestablish a connection to this question of the awakening to an orientation, to a determination, to a intervention in one's life from the infinite to one's finite life, and oriented towards the infinite. But in Dugin, what the yearning is for is prior to this Grimmishkeit, or this anger of God at awakening to not understand what's happening in Jakob Boehme, who's again comes after Luther is, and not Luther himself, let's say, but the forces of history which have found Luther in some way congenial and taken him up and been stirred and awakened by that light and seen things in that light and then moved in another direction. I think Dugin points to a position prior to Luther in the Middle Ages, so more like closer to the time of Maimonides and Aquinas, and the Convivencia in Spain, and the great Arabic scholars in the library at Cordoba. We have there, however, I see that in some ways in the light of a Grimm, in a Brothers Grimm, in the light of there's a fairy tale consciousness, which also Agamben points to in the notion of the fable. There's a fable or fabulous consciousness associated with the Middle Ages, which one can see, I believe, in the current, I think where it's most clear and really exists most is in places like Samarkand, in places like probably when you think of connection to Christians in maybe Armenia, maybe areas in the Slavic East, which are less globalized, less less constantly stirred by global discussion. And then, of course, I suppose one thinks of the old believers in Russia, but also of other Eastern Orthodox and Greek Orthodox practices, which have more of a fable and fairy tale in the Grimm's, in the sense of the Grimm's fairy tales, Dasein, and everything has that look, which is a different look than it does for us. But how to enter into the question of how has God been an awakened idea in history? So the problem is one, we have all these problems of throwing our projected view into the inner life of people today and at former times. And two, any scholarly attempt, so for instance, to be an etymology person and look at the history of the word, is not going to be adequate. So it strikes to me that taken historically, there's philosophic ideas or ideas of God reached through discussion from a very early date with the Hindus, but those ideas only overlap with the so for instance with the mythical telling, so for instance of this war between the gods and the demons in the Sea of Milk in the old Hindu legend. Early Hindu discussion verges more in the direction of then what we see much later in Athens, so it's 6th century BC, and then the so-called god of the philosophers. But is there supposed to be some other god beside from the god of philosophers in the West? So it seems to me the main reason for that is because of the Athens-Jerusalem issue. So we could go to Strauss, but there too. So we see it in Maimonides much later in the 12th century, much more rationalized version, exclusion of things that were still accepted by Josephus, exclusion of so in the most primitive version today, you have Jews who don't know anything about their tradition, who will just tell you Jews who never believed in the soul or the afterlife or things like that, which are obviously false. So I point to the problem of so in Spinoza you can see a view that there really was never anything like hardly even a henotheism. The theism, like Zeus is a henotheism. Zeus is the highest of the Olympian gods, not the highest of all the gods. He's not a cosmic god, but he's an Olympian god. And Hashem, or Yahweh, appears in the light of sort of a henotheism, but it's not spelled out in the Hebrew Bible. And the theory of monotheism is Platonic and post-Aristotelian. And you see episodes, so going back into the time when the Hindus were active, the time of the first temple, let's say, you see this episode of The Witch of Endor, which involves talking to the dead, talking to the souls of the dead. Nephesh is the word used, nephesh. So, and then 1,000 years later, there's a debate between Pharisees and Sadducees concerning whether when King Saul asked the Witch of Endor to bring back the prophet to come and speak with him, whether only the nephesh of the prophet Samuel was conjured, or whether the actual man was conjured. So we have this kind of discussion constantly in Homeric texts, in Iliad, Odyssey, in Old Greek, many Old Greek texts about are the shades, the shades of the dead. Is it the real man, or is it just a zombie of some kind? And then there's, the famous episode of Odysseus in the underworld, where we're told, this isn't really Hercules, or this isn't really Achilles, or whoever, but that the real Achilles is on the Isle of the Blessed somewhere. But what the real Achilles means is apparently some other notion of a afterlife, and not straightforwardly a regular bodily existence. So there's all kinds of confused ideas about kind of primitive, primordial soup out of which we then like what I was going to say is only about the time of Christ, then we're still having these discussions among, at the beginning of the rabbinical period. So you had the people called Cohens, Jewish priests, from the time of the temple to the rabbinical period, 1,000 years. And they're still saying, they're reinterpreting everything already, somewhat naively, somewhat, I guess from the point of view of philology, somewhat unethically. So from the point of view of a Prussian philologist who wants to keep everything, not project any motives from ourselves into the past, very unethical. They're asking the question, what does nephesh mean? And they say it means suke, which in Latin psyche, which we translate as soul. So they say that the witch of so Josephus says the witch of Endor episode, we're dealing with a suke, which is the so then we have this total ladder into Athenian, Platonic, Socratic, Greek thinking, where the suke is very important. And then you get all kinds of overlappings, and the light of this idea becomes primarily the light which we then see in the Neoplatonics, and then in Aristotle, and then there's a time when the texts aren't available. Then there's the kind of renaissance of the 13th century, when some Aristotelian texts become available to Christians, which had only been available to Muslims for the longest time. And you see this general overlap, which I think the one comment that might be useful is that in the Muslim world, the ruler and the priest can be the same. So like the Ayatollah Khomeini, who had such a bad name in the 80s, that many people that came over from Iran still today call themselves Persian, because they don't want to be associated with the political prejudice which has been felt towards Iran and America. Whereas in Christian usage, you have a split which is twofold, which is one, Caesar and God. So you have, of course, the Pope of Rome, the Bishop of Rome, or the Pope, and then you also have the Emperor, whether of the West or the East. And this goes on into the Holy Roman Empire, so-called, and it goes on in current usage in some way. But that's one part of the split. The second part is that under the conditions where the Pope of Rome or the Church is autonomous, the main condition for it historically was that they be researching what Justinian had mandated them to do, which is to reconcile man's inner instincts with the public law. The law was then said to have no contradictions. Once we get down to the 19th century, the idea of contradictions or no contradictions becomes this idea that only that which is reasonable is the true law, and that which is reasonable is that which people of sound intelligence can be convinced of if they have the time to learn it, and then therefore they can from themselves autonomously will the law to be as it is. So what does all this have to do with the effectiveness or the light of the awakening to this directive power of this idea of God. So the way it works is that very simply, there's the idea of the good is awakened in the 6th century BC in Athens, and the simple meaning of it is that progress in some sense is possible, or improvement in some sense is possible. So then we must be careful to notice that what does progress imply? It implies three things. One, progress towards the fullness of time, so to speak, as they could say it. Progress towards the most perfect completion of agathon, or the good, implies that the condition society is in at present is not perfect. And then there's the question whether one should be like a captain of a ship who's in a storm and just try to sail and keep things up as well as they can, even though knowing it's not perfect, or one should try to change tack, rewrite the rudder, and attempt to improve, because it's the admission is that progress is possible under certain conditions, but it may not be possible right now. And most perfect progress corresponds then to this so-called ontotheological version of God, which Heidegger is in some ways the great critic of. Ontotheological version of God, which has been lighting all our thinking and all current politics and all politics and everything in the West, just as much Richard Dawkins, just as much anyone who calls him John Stuart Mill, anyone who calls themselves an atheist, as anyone else, because the idea of God from the origin is a mixture of these various ideas, Hindu, Jewish, and Athenian, and then other ideas that come in along the way later, that all strive towards a certain completion, which is cogent and justified every day by just the observation of the notion of improvement of some kind. So, for instance, people will then have many arguments about whether the civil rights movement was an improvement or not an improvement, whether the 60s was an improvement or not an improvement in American society, for instance. So I think, like, for instance, the 60s in America, which led up to things which then later have gone further and are basically, it's the same thing today, where some people think pushing further is crazy. Some people think it's the same as civil rights movement and then gay marriage, or at that time contraception, for instance, all kinds of things which some people will say are an improvement, some people will say are not an improvement. And then on a larger scale, the questions Dugin's talking about, which is taking the juxtaposition of capitalism and communism as something which is much less important than the juxtaposition of the ground that those both move on, the ground of classical liberalism to the ground of traditionalism, or this other look that is on things, the other look of things, the other outlook of human beings, which is he calls that of the Middle Ages. Of for instance, he used to speak of, while she was still important, he used to speak of Hillary Clinton as the daughter of the wounded dragon. In a medieval, or let's say in Agamben's sense, in this fable way of talking, which, however, one should understand corresponds in some way to a DOS sign and the world of that DOS sign. So on the whole, so I appreciate if people would say, okay, why this was or was not at all helpful to the answer of the question, what was not discussed, which should have been discussed, but just as an attempt to orient the question and try to, if we're going to answer the question in a way that's dispositive, in a way that settles it in some way and sets us on our way and awakens in us the question, does this meet the requirements? Is what we couldn't understand, which was a stumbling block for us, removed in any way? As a coda to this, I just say, if there's a one point on this sort of Francois Guizot and the French version of the Renan of the life being the daily plebiscite, or the life of a country being the daily plebiscite, the one place where I have a strong repugnance towards that is in the case where there's a persistent false idea is in power and it can't be removed, and that this is what I understand as a DOS-mon structure. And so, for instance, the kind of notion that there's a debate between atheists at the highest level, Zizek, at the despicable level, Richard Dawkins, and others can be mentioned. Spinoza, for instance, was maybe not exactly an atheist, but then again, the reason we can't say that is because atheist is a term that is always changing its semantic field, because Socrates is called an atheist, philosophers are called atheists in the beginning of the tradition, but the word theoi meant something like the conscious or the daimon, in a very complex way, because it was said in antiquity that so Aristotle has said something about the rich, the wealthy, using the gods simply in order to justify their changes of legal codes to satisfy their need in around the time when the for a couple hundred years before Aristotle's life. And also I think Herodotus has said that Homer has given images to the gods. So it's as though Homer had taken cults, like the cults that you still get in India and street corners, and dressed them out with the legends of the Olympian gods, with the doings of which are notorious for their anthropocentric and often lurid and often scandalous content. And this then creates a great confusion over what the theoi, or the gods, were for the Greeks, but I think the Numa de Calenge's version shows that fairly well. But when you get people like the so-called Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse, Sam Harris and Dennett and so on, talking about being atheists, they speak primarily from the questions which were important when they got their formation. So questions like, in the case of Dennett, sort of questions along the line of B.F. Skinner's version of atheism as behaviorism, some kind of positivism, some kind of claim of analytic philosophy, where analytic philosophy means a form of positivism on the view that positivism means only description and then cutting up and analyzing what you've described rather than speculation or any other source of experience, such as mystical experience in the case of the Kabbalah tradition, for instance. Yeah, so this kind of split between something like Hume taken as an atheist, and then something like Hegel taken as supposed believing in the ethical substance as kind of a culmination of the philosophical idea of the good as the trait, or as the how should it be called, the thing which expresses on analogy, the Thomistic analogy of the good, the thing which in the finite world gives us some sense of the infinite, the good. And then Hegel says something like his version of liberal democracy. Yes, I know people say, people who are not very thoughtful say he wasn't a liberal, but he was. And the reason they may think that is because he was against the Prussian liberals, who are called Prussian liberal, but taken in the larger view, once you're in this debate about rationalism versus idealism, and you're taking the side of rationalism, certainly you're on the other side of the divide between traditionalism and modernism, and therefore you're a liberal in that sense. And the whole basic point of liberalism is the rights of man and the citizen, which Hegel has upheld. So therefore Hegel is on the side of liberalism. He takes a specific view, which sounds like a religious view in a certain sense, but Zizek, who calls himself an atheist, also in a large way takes that view. The way they get out of it is then, instead of speaking of transcendence, they speak of the unconscious. And there's other ways you can superimpose means of analysis over these. But so this to say, when we talk about the idea of God or the idea of atheism and how it's been effective in history, and the common popular views about this distinction, which this is what I want to say, it would be nice if we could just sweep that away with the broom and bring in something more sensible, because it's not that sensible the way it's being addressed. And I guess I'll end this by saying just that juxtaposition, where we're constantly told, there's some great difference between political acts of the, say, the 30 Years' War or something, which involved Protestants and Catholics, but not necessarily totally opposed to one another on a direct question of heresies, or two groups that wanted to mutually excommunicate one another, but with a more complexity to it. All these questions aren't adequately posed by the current debates, but the current debates only represent some small issue, just as I think it's good the way Dugin clarifies that what seems to be a vast issue, and what totally overpowers weak minds, like that of Jordan Peterson, who can't bring himself to treat with Marx or to treat with the situation of communism fairly, because he's such a great resentment against his professional colleagues who are better received than him, because they're more either able to deal with the issue more coolly, like Zizek, or because they're actually on the side of Marxism, which, although it's a minority view in the university, is mainly looked upon in with favor, I think, in some ways. So, for instance, Loc Wacquant in the sociology department at Berkeley has a French training, and anyone coming out of the French sphere who is always a priori Marxist, because that's even if they don't know it. So all these issues are complicated, and then, again, I'm not sure which direction we should go into to try to what needs to be clarified.